I'm very grateful for the invitation to come here, and been spending a wonderful semester working away on your beautiful campus, teaching eager students. Been teaching, of course, on Faulkner and Southern history, and then working on a book that I'm going to share parts of with you tonight on the historical foundations of American nationalism. This is a work in progress, and it revisits a subject that was very important to historians and social scientists during the Cold War era. And it's been kind of neglected since then, but one that I think is, you'll agree, is of enormous importance to our understanding of ourselves, especially these days. During the Cold War, the idea was that Americans saw themselves as an exceptional nation with unique blessings that enabled it to enjoy democracy and prosperity in a way that other people could never really emulate. We were an exceptional, unique nation. The argument that I'm going to take in the book and that I'm going to lay out in part tonight is that American nationalism originated in exactly the opposite beliefs, and that the Cold War emphasis on American exceptionalism was a departure, for better and for worse, from a much deeper tradition that I'm going to call American Universalism. Because America lacked common bonds of blood, land, and history, the usual ingredients of nationalism as we think of it in the old world at least, Tom Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and other leaders of the young republic made the case for American nationhood by invoking universal human rights to liberty, equality, and self-rule. America's ideals were universal, they argued. People everywhere would prefer to live as Americans lived, and would do so if it were not for the obstacles of tyranny and tradition. America's historic mission, it naturally followed, was to serve as the model republic, in which others would see how a free people might live in peace and prosperity. And America's Civil War was the greatest test, greatest challenge to this national creed. Now, the expression that I chose for tonight's lecture on, or for the general lecture series on the springtime of nations, came out of the wave of revolutions that swept across Europe in 1848. Since the Napoleonic Wars and the conservative reaction that came in 1815, there had been growing pressure for liberal reform, if not overthrow, of the old regime of church and crown. Most of these revolutionary uprisings were quickly crushed, and thousands of revolutionaries fled to other parts of Europe and to the United States. The allusion to springtime, the springtime of nations, evoked images of resurrection and rebirth, and something that was natural, something that was inevitable, something that was new and good. And it captured perfectly the mood of optimism and joy that at one time was commonly associated with the nationalist spirit. Now, today, most of us would be more likely to associate nationalism with much less pleasant images of national arrogance, racism, war, imperialism, and genocide. Nationalism now seems like one of the Western world's worst ideas, and it's no wonder that so many scholars see it as some kind of disease that we can't seem to find a cure for. They deplore, in Robert Weeby's words, quote, the moral and intellectual emptiness of nationalist programs, the imbecility of their mass followings, and the suffocating effects of nationalism's success. So my sunny appellation, the Springtime of Nations, may remind you of Mel Brooks's Springtime for Hitler in the producers. Springtime for Hitler in Germany. And I won't deny that nationalism, especially in the 20th century, to say nothing of the 21st, has kept some mighty bad company, Hitler not least among them. In the 19th century, however, what they called the national idea, they didn't use the word nationalism until late in the 19th century, was firmly aligned with humankind's most ambitious hopes for liberty, equality, and self-rule. And it's that idealism of the age of nationalism that I want to try to recall for you tonight. The national idea was not altogether novel in the 19th century. Ideas about the peoples of the world belonging to discrete national communities were not entirely a modern invention. What is the Old Testament, after all, but the story of a special people becoming a nation and struggling to fulfill its historic mission as God's chosen people? What distinguishes the modern age of nations were the novel ideas that emerged from the Enlightenment, which established the concept of nations as formal political states, not just ethnic communities, and governments deriving from the voluntary consent of citizens, rather than through the divine right of monarchs. The word republic meant the king, re, was the public. Popular sovereignty was linked to the theoretical social contract by which people owed loyalty and obedience to the sovereign, and the state in turn owed protection to the citizens. French and English Enlightenment thinkers led the way in developing the theory that all people enjoyed basic natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that the purpose of the state was to protect those rights. Enlightenment philosophers also introduced the remarkable idea that one object of the state was to protect and enhance something they called happiness or felicity, the general bearer of the people. John Hall, an English philosopher, was among the first to voice this in 1700 when he wrote that it was the duty of government to protect, quote, pristine liberty and its daughter happiness, so that people could enjoy, quote, the positive happiness of civil life. Pasquale Paoli, the Corsican revolutionary, made happiness a formal objective of the state in 1758 when he issued the modern world's first Declaration of Independence. Having reconquered its liberty, Corsicans had established a new constitution, these are Paoli's words, from which the happiness of the nation will derive. So that by the time Jefferson incorporated the pursuit of happiness into his Declaration of Independence, this peculiar new idea that happiness, felicity, the general welfare of the people was some kind of national enterprise had become familiar to the discourse of the national idea. Legal thought, also on international relations, reflected the new Enlightenment understanding of nations. The Swiss jurist Emmerich de Vattel, the father of modern international law, wrote a book called The Law of Nations, or The Principles of Natural Laws, in 1758, in which he said that nations must be considered as moral persons, bodies politic, societies of men, united together for the purpose of promoting their mutual safety and advantage, and, he added, to procure the true happiness of the nation. Modern nationalism, in other words, came about not from narrow views of human society being naturally divided into human tribes. It grew out of just the opposite notion, that all human beings were alike in having natural rights, and that all nations had an obligation to protect those rights and advance the happiness of their citizens. So what I'm calling American Universalism, it should be obvious by now, was part of a larger project, part of a larger idea about the Enlightenment's universal natural rights. It made sense that these European ideas would resonate especially with British North Americans. Their experience of migration, creating new political and social institutions in the New World, prepared them to see the possibility of starting anew and gave them practical experience in organizing social compacts and erecting new governments. Enlightenment theory about the social contract and the right to revolution also proved very useful to American revolutionaries as they cast their local struggle for independence into a broader struggle for universal human rights. As Tom Paine put it in Common Sense, the cause of America is in great measure the cause of all mankind. That's the title I'm going to use for my book, The Cause of All Mankind. Suddenly, a new nation at the distant edge of European civilization emerged, giving concrete reality to Enlightenment theories of revolution and popular sovereignty. Out of the American welter, Benedict Anderson writes, came these imagined realities, nation states, republican institutions, common citizenships, popular sovereignty, national flags and anthems, and the liquidation of their conceptual opposites, dynastic empires, monarchical institutions, absolutisms, subjectoods, inherited nobility, serfdoms, ghettos, and so forth. In America, it provided the first real models of what states should look like, and a model of the independent nation state was available for pirating. Anderson's words. And pirate they did. Thomas Jefferson, writing on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, anticipated the international influence that this document was to have. May it be to the world, he wrote, that what I believe it will be, to some sooner, to others later, but finally to all, the signal of a rousing being to burst the chains under which monkish ignorance and superstition had persuaded them to bind themselves to assume blessings and security of self-government. As Jefferson penned this in 1826, already 20 nations had written declarations of independence. Today, half of the nations of the world have their origins in such declarations of independence, and there must be at least as many with declarations of independence that have never come to fruition, that is, have never created independent states. Sometimes national independence was won by rebellions in far-off colonies, like the British North American example, and other times in wars against foreign occupation, and still others in the separation of regions from existing nations. One way or the other, separatism and secession have been close relatives of nationalism. Now, nationalism was much more than just a set of Enlightenment philosophical ideas about natural rights and the social contract. It was a popular movement full of passion. People fought and died for nations in the way that they used to for their religion. It was full of emotion, imagery, music, heroic legends, and celebration. It was a sentiment, something that people felt. And I want to just try to briefly communicate some of that to you in what I thought would be the most clear example of a kind of non-literate expression of the nation, and that is in music. This is the World of Nations in 1861. We have audio. Technological difficulties. Any of you who saw the John Adams HBO series remember that scene where at his inauguration they are singing Hail Columbia, which was the unofficial national anthem of America up until 1931 when the Star-Spangled Banner was actually occupied. And there it is, that reference to Columbia, this happy land. It always fails. It's like my grandfather's slide shows when the bulbs would go out. You remember? Shall we sing along with it? And the French Marseillaise, which, if you read the lyrics here, this is, of course, the English translation, describes a kind of bloody sense of, probably familiar with this, Come Along With Your Wish. Notice the allusions here to slavery and kings and enslavement of peoples. A song that became, of course, central to the French nationalist ideal, but also to the international movement through Europe. Should I go back to the Hail Columbia? Yes. There's a certain similarity in martial music from one country to the next. Feel free to sing along. Okay, and then moving on. And these are just samples. I apologize to the Anglophiles for skipping Britannia rules. Here's Italy, the national anthem of Italy, which the Italians decry. The soccer team can't remember the lyrics to. But here's a happy little Italian song filled with all kinds of blood-curdling images and encouragement to come and die for the nation of Italy. But this was the essence of the nationalist spirit. of course, is Garibaldi, the hero of two worlds, the image, the personification of the Italian Risorgimento. More famous, I think, among Italians was Verdi's slave chorus from Nabucco. This is about, of course, the Hebrew slaves in Egypt. It has, on the surface, nothing to do with Italy, but because it was performed under the rule of the Austrians, it became a kind of proxy for Italians longing for their homeland. Va pensiero, go thoughts to the homeland, the beautiful country. And it's a nostalgic song. And of course, Verdi became an acronym as well for Victor Emmanuel, Re d'Italia, and people would emblazon the buildings and flags with Verdi's name, also speaking for Italian unification under him. Now, according to legend, the Italians, when they heard the slave chorus, would rise and sing along with it, tears streaming down their eyes. Again, this became a kind of underground national anthem that they could sing even in front of the Austrians in northern Italy. Feel free to rise. And then closer to home, also not national anthems, but music of nationalism, and the famous battle hymn of the Republic, which was a campfire song that had various versions of John Brown's Body, and then Julia Ward Howe put to music with an intensely religious meaning in 1861, describing the Union mission as a kind of millennial cause for not just restoring the Union, but for stamping out slavery, the Confederate serpent. And then more familiar still to those of you in Richmond, it became kind of unofficial national anthem, Dixie, which has a peculiar history. It just came to light recently. It was written, of course, by an Ohioan for a minstrel show, which black minstrels, or at least people in blackface, would perform it. And it's thought to have been composed in part with the Snowden brothers, who were African American. Emmett, the author, said that he knew what it was the use that it was going to be put to. He never would have written it.
It was first performed in a musical called Pocahontas.
Pocahontas, okay, so it couldn't be more Virginia. Okay. The tunes are all a little different. The lyrics, of course, change from one country to another. But you can see the kind of universal themes in this music. The call to unity, to identity, to sacrifice, hatred of enemies, defense of the homeland, nostalgia for the place that they call their home. And for the same reason, nationalism as an idea had a kind of universal application. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence became kind of like a downloadable document that you could fill in the blanks to. David Armitage, in his book on the Declaration of Global History, counts some 400 declarations of independence, many of them borrowing verbatim from the American version. It's kind of like a generic recipe with seasoning for local tastes. And here are the basic ingredients. 1, stipulate that the government derives from a social contract whose purpose is to protect the rights of the people and enhance their happiness, as I indicated earlier. 2nd, submit copious evidence of the abuse of these rights, of the failure of the government to respond to your grievances, and proof that the social contract must be destroyed and rewritten. Now, Jefferson had 27 different counts that ranged everything from unfair trials to inciting slave rebellion. Other countries would need to fill in the blanks according to their own local narrative of abuse and suffering. Third, declare your sovereign existence. The idea of the Declaration was simply to say, we are the United States. And you are declaring it, again, to the world of nations. Now, the next steps in this recipe involve what we might describe as cooking and serving, and this met with greater difficulty. I don't need to remind an audience in Richmond that just declaring yourselves an independent nation is not always sufficient. The fourth ingredient, having declared your existence, appeal to other nations. To become a nation, you have to be recognized by other nations, especially rich and powerful ones that you can trade with, that can loan you money, that can recognize your sovereignty, and that might come to your aid militarily, either by purpose or by getting involved in breaking a blockade. And fifth, prepare for a bloody struggle at arms, because to win independence, few nations will give up territory or colonies voluntarily. Now, what was missing in the Confederate recipe for nationalism? Did the Confederacy fail, as some historians have asked, because of a failure of national unity and dedication among the soldiers and or the civilians? Drew Faust, the historian of the Civil War, and many others have emphasized how opposition from anti-secessionist fights, from slaves, from women at the home front, had undermined the cause of secession and Confederate independence. Gary Gallagher, the University of Virginia, has responded with the argument that the Confederacy was defeated not by lack of national zeal or dedication or willingness to sacrifice. It was defeated militarily, and only after 4 long years of armed resistance to the vastly superior forces of the Union. The debate over Confederate nationalism is focused almost entirely on the power of nationalism to appeal to the domestic audience, to get people to fight, to die, to get families to send their sons and brothers and so on. The nationalism, one scholar described it as the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, why we exist, what we stand for, what you're fighting for, if it involves conflict. One theory of nationalism is that it emerges in world history precisely at the time that modern warfare requires huge armies through volunteerism or through conscription, massive death tolls, heavy sacrifice at the home front. The American Civil War may not have been a total war when we compare it to World War I or World War II, but that's the direction that was pointed in. For massive destruction, massive sacrifice, huge commitments of civilian personnel to the war effort. The idea that citizens would volunteer to fight and die to maintain the independence or the unity of something called a nation is something that now we kind of take for granted, but 19th century political leaders could not. Another function of national ideology has to do with the international appeal for recognition and support abroad. Nationalism in this sense is not just the story that we tell ourselves about ourselves, it's the story that we present to the world. Why we deserve to exist as a nation, I'm using we just because. During the first 2 years of the war, the Civil War, both North and South experienced great difficulty in making this case to the world. The Confederate States of America issued their declarations of independence in what seemed to be the familiar language and logic of liberal nationalism. That is, the South was a victim of northern tyranny, it wanted to govern itself, it wanted recognition in the same way that Italy or Greece or Hungary, others wanted. They were always trying to place themselves in the world, in the age of nationalism as an aspiring nation. And the most frequent comparison, if it wasn't Italy or Hungary or Poland, was the United States of America in 1776. One Richmond editor, writing on the day that Lincoln was inaugurated, said that this day the South comes under a dominion which has been forced upon her by the North. This day she begins a servitude as involuntary as that of Italy to Austria. This day inaugurates a foreign rule as distinct and complete as if we had been conquered by European bayonets and annexed to the throne of some continental despot. Most of the Confederate States issued declarations of independence or some kind of declaration of the causes of secession. For them, the social contract wasn't an abstract theory. It was the Constitution. It was the Union that they had joined voluntarily about 1789, and that now they were going to leave voluntarily, they thought. They listed the abuses they had suffered under the present government and made it clear that there was worse to come under a Republican administration. It all appeared similar to the 1776 recipe, but there was too little of one ingredient and too much of another. Let me explain. Missing, or at least insufficient, to the Confederate recipe were the copious examples of past oppression and suffering from the existing government. Confederates were responding to what they anticipated in the future as Republican tyranny. It looked to many as though they just didn't like the results of the election of 1860, and that they were going to get out before things got worse. But this was not compelling evidence of despotic abuse at the hands of enemy rulers. The ingredient in excess, on the other hand, was slavery. When South Carolina listed its grievances, and South Carolina, you remember, was the first in December 1860, every one of the complaints that they had related to slavery. Some of it was about the fugitive slave law, and some of it, mostly, it had to do with this election of President Lincoln in the Republican Party. So what this produced was a kind of unpalatable combination of liberty-loving Confederates subjugated by northern tyrants who wanted to deprive them of slavery, a contradictory and hypocritical mix. Now, if hypocrisy was a disqualification for nationhood, the United Nations would be a very small club indeed. It didn't bother the colonists, the 13 colonies in 1776, when they complained about the British trying to enslave them, a common metaphor in revolutionary rhetoric. And at the same time, the same declaration objected to the British who were trying to enlist the slaves of Virginia into a war in exchange for, against the Patriots in exchange for freedom. How is it, the English essayist Samuel Johnson asked, how is it that we hear the loudest yelps for liberty among the drivers of Negroes? Well, the world had changed since the 1770s. The United States was both in the vanguard and in the rear guard of the international crusade to end slavery. The attack began in the late 18th century when the slave trade and the slave plantation economy were in the full ripeness of profitability and with every sign of growth and prosperity in the future. This was, in other words, not a pragmatic response to changing economic conditions. The anti-slavery crusade was a moral protest against slavery. And it flew in the face not only of profit, but also of deeply ingrained racial prejudice and deep fears as to what emancipation might portend for whites. In the courts, where slaves petitioned for their freedom, and in state legislatures and parliaments around the Atlantic world, the movement to abolish slavery and the slave trade gained steady ground, beginning during the American Revolution. By 1860, the American South stood alone among the states of the Union and alone among the republics of the world in sanctioning slavery. Only the Empire of Brazil and the remnants of the Spanish Empire, Cuba and Puerto Rico, the New World, continued to sanction slavery. The end of slavery had taken place by and large through the bloodless acts of legislation and court decisions. Only in Haiti had slavery been drowned in blood. In America, the moral appeal of anti-slavery played into the nationalist narrative of America as a model republic, a providentially favored nation that others would look upon as an example. American anti-slavery gained tremendous energy from the religious zeal of the Second Great Awakening. It was essentially a spiritual appeal that asked Americans to weigh the pursuit of wealth against the moral cost of slavery. And it was also a nationalist appeal that asked Americans to redeem the republic, to redeem the nation, to make it again an example to the world in the eyes of God, as well as the eyes of other nations. William Lloyd Garrison, founder of the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1831, electrified the movement when he called for total and immediate abolition without compensation and without delay. Garrison's followers publicized the moral evils of slavery, particularly its sexual violation of women, its physical cruelty to slaves, and its proclivity to break up families and separate children. Harriet Beecher Stowe put this into her novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and gave to Americans, at least to Northerners who were reading this, the sufferings of characters, fellow Christians, that every reader could identify with. Now, most Southern slaveholders thought of Garrison and Stowe and the other abolitionists as a lunatic fringe of misguided fanatics who vilified Southern slaveholders out of ignorance and zealotry. What they may not have appreciated was that Garrison and Stowe and others were trying to nationalize the sin of slavery. The cruelest figure in Uncle Tom's Cabin, for example, is Simon Legree, a Yankee, who is driven by greed, who comes to the South and is far crueler than the sometimes more paternalistic Southern slaveholders. They wanted to nationalize, that is, to make into the sin of slavery into a kind of collective shame, and to make its abolition an act of moral redemption for the nation. Within a relatively short period of time, an international movement to close the slave trade and put it into slavery, a movement that began as a small and seemingly hopeless group of reformers, had won the day, one country after another, one state after another in the United States. Now, not all people were won over to anti-slavery, and fewer still to the idea of universal human rights for blacks. But slavery in principle had become indefensible in most of the Atlantic world by the middle of the 19th century. And by the time the Confederacy took its cause for nationhood abroad, it had entered a world in which even the most hard-nosed and self-interested diplomats and politicians had to consider the popular appeal of anti-slavery in their countries. As this enormous shift in moral sensibility was occurring, the American South was isolating itself from criticism, closing off debate, repudiating anti-slavery thought as insurrectionary, and demonizing its advocates as fanatical enemies. The Virginia legislature in 1831 and 32 entertained the first and the last full, open public discussion of the future of slavery in America. Had things gone differently, Virginia might have led the American South down a path of gradual emancipation and the peaceful end of slavery in America. But as it turned out, instead, they helped the South turn toward closing off debate, toward repressing dissent, and denouncing anyone who would threaten the safety of slavery. The retreat into pro-slavery orthodoxy came to some degree from the growing fear of the slaves themselves, the Nat Turner Rebellion in Virginia, other uprisings throughout the Caribbean and in Brazil. But the main cause was the abolitionists themselves. Secessionists in 1860 and 61 had to reach out to Southern whites who were becoming increasingly afraid of the cost of slavery in terms of these slave rebellions and how they might imperil their safety. And at the same time, the Confederacy had to appeal to the international world. And very often, the two audiences and the two messages contradicted one another. Jefferson Davis, the new Confederate president, did not have a lot of overseas exposure except for his participation in the war against Mexico. But he understood perfectly that the world abroad was not going to buy pro-slavery nationalism. His inaugural address was a very careful, not to say plodding, rehearsal of the logic and language of the Declaration of Independence. Confederate states derived from the American idea that government rests on the consent of the government, and it is the right of the people to affect or alter the government, on and on. We are not a rebellion. We are a peaceable, legal, constitutional withdrawal from this social contract. But many of Davis's fellow Confederates, accustomed to defending Southern rights in hyperbolic language against Northerners and against moderates within the South, were very slow to realize how this put their cause, this pro-slavery rhetoric, in bad odor abroad. Davis's vice president, Alexander Stephens, for example, delivered a sensational speech in Savannah in March 1861 that put forth the Confederates' national mission to safeguard slavery and ensure white racial control of blacks. Stephens was a fragile figure. He weighed under 100 pounds and he had kind of a shrill voice, but apparently was a very rousing orator. And he gave this audience in Savannah just what they wanted to hear in his cornerstone speech as it came to be known. He denounced Thomas Jefferson to begin with and said that all the founding fathers had it wrong when they said that the enslavement of the African was in violation of the laws of nature, that it was wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. Our new government, Stephens said, is founded on exactly the opposite idea. Its foundations are laid, its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, subordination to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth. Stephens obviously expected his ideas would be applauded abroad, as they were in Savannah. It is upon this, as I have stated, he went on, that our social fabric is firmly planted, and I cannot permit myself to doubt the ultimate success of a full recognition of this principle throughout the civilized and enlightened world. But Jefferson Davis knew better, and he excoriated Stephens for shooting off like this. This letter would be circulated by Union diplomats throughout the capitals of Europe. And Davis did a follow-up speech to kind of back off from this position of white supremacy and pro-slavery. But he too proved a little tone deaf. What he did was to trot out the old argument that the British were the ones to blame for slavery, and that Southerners were to be congratulated for elevating Africans, quote, from brutal savages into docile, intelligent, and civilized agricultural laborers. And that they had also been generously supplied not only with bodily comforts, but careful religious instruction. Now, other Confederate diplomats and politicians continued to feel confident that they could persuade Southern foreigners that slavery was really in their best interest for the cotton trade, and that it wasn't as bad as they thought. Henry William Ravenel of South Carolina wrote at one point that the word slavery seemed to be putting people off, and that maybe they should find some other kind of term for these. But these old prejudices, he argued, would disappear once Europeans became more intimately acquainted with slavery. Well, the Union, too, was very slow in learning how to present their case for nationhood to the world. Lincoln's early pronouncements on secession and the call to arms, especially in his first inaugural address, had all the passion and the moral idealism of a legal brief. He was essentially picking apart the Southern case for secession. The Union is perpetual, not a contract, he argued, that one party can back out of on a whim. If secession were allowed to become a state did not like an act of legislation or the outcome of an election, anarchy would come about. All of this revolved around the constitutional right of the nation to exist in perpetuity. And it created a kind of circular argument that the nation has a right to exist because it exists as a nation. Nations don't self-destruct. Nations are forever. For the better part of 2 years of slaughter on the battlefield and tremendous suffering at home, both North and South avoided the major issue that had led to war, which was the future of slavery in America. Confederates declared they wanted only self-government and freedom from Northern tyranny. The Union said this was treasonous rebellion and insisted foreign interference and domestic insurrection would constitute a violation of international law. What neither side understood at this point in the war was that the very idea of nationalism that had inspired and guided both sides in this conflict had also redefined the moral basis for nationhood. And as each side made its case to the world of nations, they were forced to come to terms with the basic question: what is the purpose of this war? Why do we deserve to exist as a nation?